Welcome back to another episode of The Architecture of Health. My guest this week is Nicholas Simpson. He's a kinesiologist and he's a strength and conditioning specialist who works with Olympic athletes and a lot of other types of movers. I met Nick online during COVID when I needed some help with my own physical conditioning, and remotely he was able to introduce me to rotational weight training and ways of training that I had never seen in a regular gym. So welcome, Nick. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to see you again.
And I also have been lucky that I got to follow up and did some foot strengthening work remotely with Nick and Carla's company, Vital Strength and Physiology. I also did a weekend-long conditioning training where we learned more about gait training. And since I've been at restoring my movement to abilities I didn't even have in junior high, Nick is
You're
high on my list. Nick has helped me get pretty far. Oh, what were you going to say, Nick?
your running looks amazing these days.
It's getting there. It's getting
Yeah.
there. And I have to say, if I hadn't run into you during COVID, I wouldn't have ever started in this direction. So I thank you a lot. And now I have to say, my biggest challenge is still my foot strength. I
Hmm.
have so many. I'd broken a metatarsal on my left foot. I had severe sprains in my ankle. My left knee, I tore an ACL at one point. So that was one thing I noticed is when I did your 2-month remote foot strengthening, I was able to get a new ability, an ability to run a little longer before my hyper elastic body, my hypermobile body started to wobble out. So
Yeah.
thanks for the
And
compliment.
a lot of people don't know this, but one of the pretty much the main muscle for propulsion in running is the soleus. Um, so one of the ankle flexors, but that ankle stiffness and strength is super important.
Wow. So
And
this show today is all about feet, and yet I usually bring the guest in with a little bit of some kind of a crash because I think crashes
hmm,
or aha moments are the biggest places, opportunities for change, especially when from the outside, I would look at an elite athlete and say, never possible. I've always hated running. I would never try. And yet, now that I know the technology is out there for how the body works, but it took me crashing like my hips both completely crashed for me to even look at how I walk and run. So, how did you even get, because your mindset about movement is different than a lot of other people I'd encountered. Let's start there before we go into feet. So tell me a
yeah.
little bit about your any aha moment you got about how the body moved differently than what mainstream strength or conditioning work.
Um, so I had both like crashes on my own personal end of thing, as well as, yes, in a sense, with the athletes that I was working with. And like you alluded to, I worked for the Canadian Sport Institute for a long time, about 10 years or so. So I worked with the speed skating athletes for 2.5 Olympic quads. Um, and one of the unique things about that was also it wasn't just the national team athletes, but it was all the development groups as well. So like the very young speed skaters, the kind of ones just below the national level, the development team, and then the national team and the Olympians. And so I got to see this spectrum of like youth and less experienced athletes all the way up to the top, and also helped some of the same athletes develop through that entire path while working with them. And so it's just an opportunity not many people get to work with some athletes for that long. But it let me see some patterns. And with the Olympic athletes, it often wasn't the strongest ones in the weight room who were winning medals. It was, not that they were weak by any means, but they were on the national team. They were very strong individuals who were stronger than the ones who were winning medals. So when that's the case, you can't really say that like strength in the traditional sense is the gap that they're lacking. in order to like close that extra distance. And then we also had development athletes, the younger ones, who are stronger than athletes on the national team. And so like if they're already stronger, then it's probably not that typical weight room strength that's holding them back from getting to the next level. And this wasn't just in the weight room, sometimes it was in the physiology lab too. So you could have athletes that were like, very good cardiovascular systems, could push very high numbers on the bike. But then again, something wasn't translating when they're trying to skate. And, speed skating is a notoriously technical sport. Like, not that there isn't a technical aspect to being on a bike, but it's easier for most people to learn how to bike and the nuances with that than it is for them to learn how to speed skate. Now, so for myself, uh, you know, a typical strength coach often takes the perspective that getting the athletes stronger and more powerful is their job. That's their like role. And teaching movement is not part of that role. That's the job of the coach or someone else. And, there is arguments can be made for that, but they'll say like, if I can make your squat go up, if I can make you jump higher or power clean more weight, like I've done my job. I don't need to do anything else. And it's up to you, the athlete and the coach, to make them better at the actual sport. So that's one perspective. It's not necessarily the wrong one. I won't say that, but the other perspective that I started to adopt is that like, you know, strength and power are relative to the task that you're trying to accomplish. So my job doesn't end at just making them better squatters or jumpers or Olympic lifters or whatever it may be. I have to see like what are the gaps for them expressing strength and power in their sporting movements, and is there something in the weight room or like on dry land that I can do to address those. And so that's what we started to do with the national team skaters, where they were already strong, but we'd ask the coaches, what are those athletes trying to do technically on the ice, like, or what are you asking them to do technically that they're not able to do? And we'd often get an answer back like, I've told that athlete 1,000 times not to do this thing or to do this thing instead, and they're just not doing it. I don't know what else I can do, like, since it's just been repeated already so much. So myself and the med staff, we call them, but the physiotherapists and the other therapists involved in the team, we would just take that feedback from the coach and then see if we could make a little diagnostic for why the athlete may or may not be able to do that movement. So say they wanted the athlete to like fully extend their leg in the push off in speed skating. First thing we do is see, does that athlete have like the passive range of motion in their joints to actually do that thing? So you'd take them onto the physio table and massage table, and the therapist would check to see if that they had that passive range. And sometimes the answer was no. And so that was kind of a simple, well, it doesn't matter how many times you tell them to do that, then they're not going to be able to accomplish it if they don't have that capacity. So the intervention at that point could be, some directed stretching. It could be some work from the therapist to improve that joint range of motion. It could be some strengthening that's biased to those range of motions. And the second question was, if they had the passive range of motion, did they have the active range of motion? So we can like hold them or hold their limbs and put their joints in that position. But if we ask them to do it themselves, can they do that? And sometimes the answer was no. So, okay, they have the ranges there, but they're lacking some kind of strength or control to get their body in that position. And then if we check that step off, okay, they have the passive range, they have the active range. Are they actually, do they have strength and power in that position, or can they express those things? Because especially when you're trying to do something as hard as possible or as fast as possible, your body wants to take the path of least resistance, or what it thinks is the path of least resistance. So yes, they can get there, but if they're not strong in that position, their body's going to start to shift to positions that it thinks it is stronger in. So um, again, when we get to that step, if it's this very like, I guess not odd, but if it's a unique position that they're not as strong as they should be in, it's kind of obvious to me, like, if they're already squatting 400 pounds, trying to make them squat 450, they'll be stronger in the general sense, but it's probably not going to improve the
The
joint strength and
specific,
the
yeah, the
specific thing.
specific task. And that's how I've been so excited to play with running and enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
Is I watch my film, and then I see, why couldn't that foot push? Am I leaning this way? And and uh and before I had an idea of what would be a task worth doing. As a recreational athlete, it's been kind of hard to pick a task
Mm-hmm.
worth doing. And then once I learned that moving forward through space is so much of our design,
Mm-hmm.
and that it can be measured, an athlete can measure how fast they're moving forward through space, that attracted me to this realm. And one thing that you're saying too is, especially us recreational athletes, we stress out faster because we haven't necessarily built up a capacity and we have all sorts of compensatory patterns
Mm-hmm.
that go harder, weekend warrior, just go and go harder, and then
Yeah.
all sorts of downstream negative side effects. And slowing down enough to shore up my gaps. That's one reason I'm doing really short runs until I get the technique down. So how about foot strength? How did that emerge? Because that's one of the most important things I've learned in the time with you was actually that, for example, when I took your online foot strength program, none of them, very few of them were specific toe exercises.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of it was a whole body integration of the way you're placing the weight or the way you're pushing off of it, or you have a weight off to one side. Can you tell me a little bit about how you started to think about foot strength, and then what are the components of getting foot strength?
Yeah. And so part of it was like attached to what I just described with the athletes I was working with, where as I learned movement better and how the body moves better, had a better idea of how everything was integrated, then it took its place. And part of it was sort of that own crash that I told you about. But um, I had a back injury in my early 20s, where probably for about a year after that initial injury, I couldn't fully extend my left leg, even walking. Um, it would just pull on the tissue so much. And often when you have a back injury, there's something called myotomes that the physio tests. So they'll each section of your spine has motor nerves that come out of it. So you can test the strength of the muscles innervated by those nerves from each section, and kind of, without doing imaging, get an idea of like where the issue is in your spine. But for I think the L4-5 disc root, they'll often test your big toe strength. And when they would test mine, my big toe would just kind of flop down, like it had zero strength to it during that period of the back injury. And I never really noticed anything from that per se at that time. But I think over the year or so or more that I was dealing with that, it probably created this subtle shift where I didn't want to put pressure through the inside edge of that left foot. So I started to rely on the outside more. And then a few years after that, I tore the ATFL ligament in my left ankle. It was a biking accident going over the handlebars.
Ow.
But I after in the after that and in the recovery for that, it's where I noticed my movements start to get really wonky. So I really started to twist when I was squatting. And I'd always twist counterclockwise on the way up. So like shifting pressure to the outside of that left again, and my right knee would sort of cave in with that. And then like asymmetries is a whole other discussion. And, some people really hyper focus on them, and some people say like a lot of the best athletes at the top of the world have them and they're still excelling. So like why hyper focus on these small shifts? But for myself, that wasn't necessarily something that I always had. That was something that developed in response to an injury, and that I believed was going to cause further issues if I didn't resolve it. And then again, around that same time, I started playing around with more movement and rotational movements. And I would notice that in rotational movements, I would often lose my balance over to my left side. Like if I did something rotating to the right, I'd be nice and rock steady. If I did something to the left, like my ankle would almost roll to the outside and I couldn't keep my big toe down. But that was where I started to say, okay, something's going on in that foot. I need to address it. I started Googling foot exercises. And really at that time, the only thing that came up was like some odd ballet exercises. So, here's some basic physio exercises like toe scrunches and like little
Yeah. And
towel grabbing stuff and
I want to
stretches for
add
the
in,
toes.
when I used to teach Go Clay method of primal posture, we had it because did a little bit of walking retraining. It was mostly to get people out of back pain, everyday movement, but this is a long time ago. Well, we would address that the feet needed to be more like hands and have the ability to be springy. But to address it, we had, we didn't have very many ways to talk about how to address it. And now that I know that as asymmetrical beings with our organs being heavier on our right, we tend to be 90% right turned, and that the left side is the one that tends to get more, it's destabilized. And so learning to wind both ways is what you showed in the Hussein Bolt spine, as it was winding and unwinding, even though the guy has scoliosis and his feet are funny looking, but he knows how to wind and unwind himself to create bursts of power. And I had never even thought of how, something in a wave that captures the drop and recycles it, how that's way faster than a flat line. So of course our feet, 26 bones, of course there's more there than toe scrunches and towels, grip, like wrinkling up a towel. There's way more. That's because your feet are a reflection. However we're pressing in the ground is, like you were just saying, a correlation to our back, a correlation to our whole. And there are other movement practices that I've been studying that how we breathe, you can read in the feet, the foot pressure will tell you how you're breathing. So you started to work with athletes. Well, in yourself, you addressed your feet. You it sounds like you saw there weren't very many options. A few physios saying towel scrunch and things. And then what?
Well, around the same time, I was starting to run again and learn more about running. I was exposed to some of like WEC method and GOTA stuff, and GOTA especially has that strong emphasis on the foot. And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of that now, but they talk about they like to say arches aren't meant to collapse, but they have a lot of drills that are and they don't like to use this terminology either, but basically around the supinated foot, like maintaining that really high arch and building an arch. And they have some interesting drills and some rotational movement in there. But aside from those like individual toe exercises, I started playing around with a lot of different drills to emphasize supination and just working a very supinated foot into other exercises and building kind of that side of strength. And I did see a lot of progress from emphasizing that, but it didn't completely resolve my issues. So
And
it was
just
an
for the
improvement.
audience, supinated means archy, like the outside edge of the foot is getting, and it's almost like you could, eat soup. You could
Yeah.
scoop soup with it
And
versus what's a pronated is more where the inside arch comes down. Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Or
like I mean, I'll use the hand as the same way you did there, but and we often talk about it in the hand, but they talk about the cup of soup for your hand with supination or pouring out the soup with pronated. But in the foot, you can think as pronated as all the bones kind of spread out and you get that really flat shape in the foot. Not all the joints, but most of them. And then as you supinate your foot, you're kind of pulling things tight together. So it creates that high arch in the foot. And most of the joints come together. Um, but so I was emphasizing a lot, but I always like to hear different perspectives. And so I try to listen to people at both extremes. And two of the other sort of big names that were talking more about pronation. One was David Gray and the value of it, but then the other one was Gary Ward and from Anatomy in Motion. And I think a lot of David's stuff originally comes from Gary, anyways. But so I did one of Gary's courses online, the lower body biomechanics, and he had a very nice way of explaining how the foot moves and how those joints are connected. Um, that really connected with me, and um, that kind of influenced my view that the um, foot is not really an arch that's like not meant to collapse, but
it's a
almost should.
spring. It's a
Yeah, spring.
spring.
And I think of a trampoline almost, and when people look at someone's like an image of someone's foot, or just like any kind of one shot, and they see a flat foot or a pronated foot, you can't really judge anything from a single image because you could get to that same shape in the foot uh, from an angle that would be either like promoting good function or from an angle that's not associated with good function in the foot. And so, I'd say the way a foot should function is you have this, tensile structure like a trampoline. And then when your foot strikes the ground and that load pushes down on it, that's that trampoline getting stretched. And then it should rebound really well from that position to drive you forward into movement. But you could also have, say a very flaccid, like um, non-functional foot where it's in that same pronated shape, but there's no rebound or recoil associated with that. It's just kind of flopping down and slapping the ground.
And I learned only in my 50s that
Hmm.
my rigidly high arches. I was very supination biased, mostly on the outer edge of the foot. I didn't have much of that big toe propulsion,
Hmm.
or the going in with the internal rotation to then drive, to get the power to go back. And I was doing all these very flat and wide things my whole life to avoid running. So I
Yeah.
couldn't wind in and spring forward. So that ability, and what was shocking to me was I always looked at the foot in isolation. Like,
Hmm.
oh, here is the foot, here is an arch support for the foot, here is, and I never saw that the two bones in the lower leg make up the ankle, and that
Yeah.
that if they can't turn, the trampoline can't work, and
Yeah.
that it goes all the way up. It goes all the way up. So foot health, super important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then I mean, you can even have things working in the opposite direction at the foot and the hip, and then creating some stresses around the knee and the other joints that aren't very beneficial in the long run. But one of the drills that we often have people do during their assessments is just kind of roll back and forth between the edges of their feet. So take both feet to the inside edge and then take both feet to the outside edge and just go back and forth. And I'll video it and I'll demo it and then I'll show them. And I just want them to pay attention to how everything is connected up the chain. And so when they go to the inside edge of the foot, you'll see the shins rotate in, the knees rotate in, the thighs rotate in. When you go to the outside edge of the foot, you'll see the exact opposite happen, like the shins, knees, and thighs rotate outwards. So everything's connected there. You can't really avoid those things. And then, you know, not that like knock-kneed or valgus knees are always a bad thing. They're not. But if you were to say that someone was doing that excessively, often the first thing that gets addressed, or the only thing that gets addressed, is the glute and the hip. And they'll say, well, your knee's caving in and your glute med at the hip pulls the femur and knee outwards. So we need to strengthen your hip in order to prevent your knee from collapsing in. And so they'll prescribe something like clamshells to help that. And not to say that never helps, but then I'll demonstrate, well, what if I like force myself to stay on the inside edge of my foot and then I try to use my hip to pull my knee out? And as long as I don't let my foot move off the inside edge, my knee's not going to move. It's going to stay in that kind of knock-knee position. Then it's very apparent to people, okay, well, those two things need to be connected and they need to be working in the same direction. So I could have a strong glute, but if I have a weak foot, I'm not going to be able to do what I need to do.
And,
So a lot of
and what you're saying is the knee is an expression of the foot and the hip of what's going on. I mean, of course, there
yeah.
can be direct knee tissue damage like my torn
Mhm.
thing. But again, when there's that spot mentality, like I'm going to the knee or the glute med, is what you're saying, is if it doesn't include the foot and the neurological aspect of our foot pressure on the ground tells our nervous system where we are. And
Mhm.
yeah. So what do you, as far as, so you've designed a strengthening program that's remote. You also work with people in person, but what are some decisions besides training differently, training the foot and the hip differently? Well, it sounds like, to summarize though, that you, through your research, you found that having this trampoline, restoring
Mhm.
this trampoline was the goal. And what things, uh, and it sounds like some of these rotational full body training movement is what you helps restore this trampoline, or are there a bunch of other things too?
I mean, there can be a lot of things. And so, yeah, you mentioned before the foot program had a lot of integrated exercises. And I think, yeah, a big part of it is getting that foot and that hip to work together. Um, so we often go to those rotational drills first that involve the whole body. And not that you couldn't isolate them, but I just haven't found much of a benefit. And it moved away from doing a lot of isolated kind of toe or foot exercises. And not that there's never a value for them, but I found when you do the other exercises, that stuff develops anyways, and you get um, just more overall benefit in less time. And it's more engaging to move your whole body around than to, sit there with like a band wrapped around your toe and try to flex it and then do each one individually or all four motions of it. Um, I
What about
lost my train of.
footwear and toe
Oh yeah.
spacers and barefoot walking? Yeah.
So I guess that's the other thing is just being barefoot or close to barefoot more often. Because in so many shoes, you can't really tell what your foot's doing. It's kind of like having mittens on. So you lose this like sensation and control around your foot. And you can like, you know, maybe emphasize different parts a little bit, but it's just very muted. So there's research on there's a lot of research on running and barefoot shoes. And we often tell individuals and runners to be very cautious with that because at least for the first 6 months to a year, if you're trying to transition to running in a minimal shoe, your risk of injury can be quite a bit higher because it's so much more impact than usual. And it takes a while to adapt your body to that impact. And especially if you're already a reasonably fit runner, um, no one wants to really like scale back their volume to give their like body time to adjust to that stimulus. So they might try like I'm going to change my shoes, but then I'm doing my normal amount of running in it, and I think that would definitely be a mistake. Maybe it involves doing like if your goal was to run in minimal shoes, swapping out one workout a week for a while, one easy workout in minimal shoes. But the other way to do it, which we recommend for most people, is keep your comfy, cushy running shoes for running, but start doing more everyday activities in minimal shoes. And there's research around that as well, where if you just swap out your everyday shoes for minimal shoes, all the intrinsic muscles in your feet start to get stronger. Um, and again, you'll develop a better feel and better proprioception for what's happening at your foot. The other, another thing layered on top of that is if someone's been in cushy shoes their whole life, often the bottom of their feet are quite sensitive. Um, so they're not necessarily ready to be like soft and sensitive. Um, and it just might seem too intense at the beginning to go fully barefoot, especially for activities. So having a very small like Vibram sole as you adapt to that, and then eventually going barefoot more. But I like to do a lot of strength workouts and warm ups barefoot when I can. And then if you're again doing harder, heavier impact activities, then throw the cushy ones on.
And
Um,
African dance, I've been lucky. It's a barefoot activity,
yeah.
and the artists from West Africa, their feet vary, of course, but for the most part, there's a long arch from the balls of the toes to the front of the heel, a very long, very low, long arch. And so my bizarrely rigidly high arches don't have the potential tension they can generate
Hmm.
with the long trampoline that they have. It's really it blew my mind. I was like, oh, they've got problems with their feet. They don't have high
Oh
arches. And
yeah.
then I learned it was the other way around, that I
Yeah.
was the one with the problem with having too high of arches. Yeah.
Well, and I think you posted a graphic from a study recently about that. And we had a different one with slightly different numbers in our course, but you know, more often people associate flat feet with issues and injuries and like overpronation. Um, but one of those studies we looked at said that the higher pronation foot posture was associated with 20-fold risk of injury in running compared to the neutral foot. But the high supination was associated with almost 80 times higher risk of injury. Um,
No.
and there can be um, multiple reasons for that. But again, when they talk about how the foot should work, they'll say that the process of pronating, so going from your kind of higher arch supinated foot as it strikes the ground to spreading out and pronating, that helps to absorb the force of the impact. So that's kind of a cushioning effect. But if, and Then that resupination, like as you toe off and it pulls back tight, we'll say that that's important to create the rigid lever so that you have something solid to push off of. Um, Whereas obviously if you're spread out and loosey-goosey, that wouldn't be a great thing to push off. But if your foot's stuck in that supinated shape and it's just very rigid all the time, then when it strikes the ground and it maintains that and doesn't spread out, all that shock is going up the chain. And because like supination tends to drive the pressure to the outside edge of the foot, and like that travels up the outside of the leg, and pronation tends to spread things and bring the pressure to the inside edge of the foot, and that pressure goes more up the inside of the leg. If you're stuck in either one of those positions, the associated injuries tend to differ. So low arch runners tend to have more knee injuries, soft tissue injuries, and medial injuries, meaning injuries on the inside of the leg. High arch runners tend to have more ankle injuries, bony injuries, and lateral injuries, so injuries on the outside of the leg. So again, being stuck in either one of them is not great. And being stuck anywhere in your body just means that one spot's going to get repetitively loaded and it never really gets a break. So part of what tends to reduce the injury risk with like all of this movement in general, and the waviness of the body and everything, is that it spreads the forces out. And some things get a break while other things are working.
And that the buildup of the tension is almost never where that buildup started. Like you're saying, the place that the foot you're talking about in running, the places in the body that the injuries show up isn't in the foot itself. So most people wouldn't look at the way they're using their foot. Now, one question about orthotics, because many years ago, one philosophy was, well, they're a crutch, but if you need to keep your knee and hip in place, if you've got pain, okay, use it, but also start using your foot to kind of grab at the orthotic to start to build the muscles on the bottom of the foot. But I also heard recently a different idea, which was someone with rigidly high arches would benefit because we're not walking on uneven surfaces, would benefit with something for that arch to push into so that the arch could get the idea, oh, that's how you push on the inside edge. Any comments about Gen Pop and arch supports?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think of them currently as a bit of a crutch, because most of the things that we want to like improve or strengthen the body, like in order to strengthen something, you have to make its life harder in some way.
Not
And
easier.
yeah, and and this isn't how I would coach squatting, but this example still gets across to people where, and if, say, someone's knees were caving in a squat and you thought that was a problem, sometimes what people would do to cue the right movement is they would put a band around the knees. And so the band around the knees makes the knees want to get pulled in more, but it gives people the feedback to push out and they develop some strength from that. But if someone's knees were caving in and you did the opposite, you like attached bands from the outside that pulled their knees out for them, well, then you could see that probably all the muscles that did that naturally in the body would just get weaker because they have to work less than normal to create the movement you want. So there is research with orthotics where, say, if someone was an overpronator and like coming to the inside too much, if you put them in orthotics that helps take them out of that position, the muscles in the feet have to work even less. And I think like they saw an atrophy of around like 30 or 40% within like a 12-week period.
Wow. What about over supinators?
I haven't seen as much research on that, and it's and for correcting that with orthotics. But and where I would, you know, say I'm okay with it, if someone's developed an injury where being in a certain position is causing them pain, and you don't have the luxury of like taking time off and resting that tissue, so you're a competitive runner, um, or you have some kind of event coming up, an orthotic can be a good short-term strategy to reduce the load on the injured tissues. And I haven't seen any studies where they've just combined, say, like an orthotic and foot strengthening, like you mentioned. I have doubts whether if you told most people just to like start grabbing the orthotic with their toes, if they would
Actually do
do
it.
that often enough, like do it, period. And if that would be enough of a stimulus to actually like create the desired effect. But if you had an orthotic and you did like what it might be more legitimate foot strength training, would you see any negative effect? Maybe not. And then you could use the orthotic to manage the load, make your foot stronger, and then eventually get rid of it.
And I heard you say taking breaks, because most of us, I'm not a pro athlete. I can take breaks and recover as much as
Yeah.
I want to. My
Mhm.
my problem is not working enough to be working, hard enough. Because and yet, I was going to ask too. I wonder if toe spacers would be even more important for an oversupinator than for a
Yeah.
pronator.
I think that could probably, again, help to spread those joints out and to encourage the more pronated foot. And I had an interesting experience with foot spacers myself. And so, again, because I never paid attention to my feet, I often wore shoes where my toes were cramped all the time. When I started working on my foot, my toes were all like quite smashed together. I couldn't really spread them out. I remember when I did have some toe shoes, like with the individual toes, it was a pain in the ass to get my foot in there because like I would have to use my fingers to help like put my toes in the right position so that they would actually slide in, which is kind of at the time discouraged me from wearing them. Um, but I started using toe spacers, and I would notice that maybe after like 15 minutes, my kind of foot would start to burn. Like I didn't want the toe spacers in there anymore. So I'd take them out and I'd just do like short intervals at the end of the day. And then the time I could have them in before that discomfort came got longer and longer. And then when we had some lockdowns during COVID and we weren't allowed to go to the gym, I just started wearing them like all day, more or less. And when I started wearing them that more often, I remember in my right foot one day, it almost felt like a bone displaced around my like fourth or fifth metatarsal. So it gave me a kind of a weird pain and feeling in that foot. So I took a break from the toe spacers, but it actually felt like something unglued itself. And so I gave it a break. I like toned down my running, but eventually that pain went away and my foot was kind of broader. And then eventually the same thing happened in my left foot. It just took maybe like 2 or 3 months longer before that happened. And then ever since then, they've never like gone back to being glued together.
Yeah, my rigidly high arch, the foot is super narrow in the back and then wide in the toe, and I can tell
mm,
that the bones, there's pressure among the bones there, and I can feel. I like some of your class had these foot winding things. I think Goda does
mm,
these foot winds, and I can feel like all these little bones wanting to shift. So I'm
mm,
excited about the possibility of having not rigidly high arches. I'm on it. I also do myofascial release, like with the
yeah.
lacrosse ball or a golf ball. I like a golf ball on the bottom of my foot too. And in your
Yeah.
online class, you do some lower leg and behind the knee releases as well, which
Yeah. And that just reminded, like, I remember FP put out a post once where they said they didn't like toe spacers, especially because it was a passive intervention. But I just don't agree with that. I think for most people, when you've spent like decades in cramped shoes, it's just going to be extremely challenging to get enough volume through active work alone.
volume. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so like you can really accelerate the process with a combination of active and passive work around the foot, whether that's the toe spacers and rolling or massage or some treatment with the movement and the strengthening.
And
Um,
anything you want to say about plantar fasciitis? Because, and what I will say first is my friends, we're in our 50s, they're all falling apart. All the recreational athletes, and plantar fasciitis is the word I heard like 3 times in the last couple of weeks. And I right away got them to look at their hip position. And I started to explain how the stressors could add up, and there's something you can do about it. Biomechanically, there's a lot you can do about it. Is there anything you want to? And I might even be wrong about one thing. If the bottom of the foot is like overly like strained, like there's not enough tension, and
yeah,
then the tendons, or the attachments can get strained. Is there anything you want to explain about plantar fasciitis, about what you do with it?
yeah. I think one of the most important things is to strengthen the intrinsic muscles in the feet there. And basically, like all of those, like, and just for the audience again, they generally divide kind of the foot muscles up between um, intrinsic and extrinsic, but intrinsic just means in the foot itself. So all the tiny
Ah,
little ones that control the toes, and then extrinsic means it's outside the foot, but all the muscles in the calf, which is a lot more than just your calves. Uh, but they'll control the rotation and the function of the foot as well. But all of those little muscles, there's some research that they'll help to spread that shock out from the impact. But when they're weak, it's basically just the fascia, the passive tissue that takes the whole load. Um, so a great way to reduce that stress is make all the little muscles stronger to absorb it.
no wonder
Um,
so many dance disciplines have a lot of foot protocols, like you said, ballerinas, and uh, that's one risk. Someone like me who learned to dance as an adult, who didn't have that training in foot strength when I was young, has a lot more to
yeah,
catch up with.
yeah. And I was just reading some notes there in the background, but in so toe weakness, tight calves, and weak peroneals are probably some of the three biggest
Where are the
factors in plantar.
peroneals?
So the peroneals are the muscles on the outside of the calf. Um, so you'll see like when when people have them well developed, you'll see kind of two or three lines on the
Lines.
outside of the calf. But they'll pull the outside edge of the foot upwards. Um, so when you are holding your foot in the air, they'll actually kind of contribute to pronating the foot by lifting that outside edge, or you can use them to exaggerate pronation on the ground by lifting that outside edge. Um, but they'll also get stretched as you supinate the foot. Um, and their load in that lengthened position will help to protect the foot and ankle on the outside. So if someone if someone's always on the inside of their foot, and they're great at their big toe push off and everything, but they've never kind of trained the outside, then you're liable for um, rolling your ankle if like you hit something and you're not strong in that lengthened position. That stuff will tend to just collapse and then the ligament takes the stress there. But if you train the outside and your peroneals and the lengthened, you'll be able to like go back and forth more easily without so much of a risk to rolling your ankle.
So that now I understand even more some of the design of the program I took online. There are the ones where the big toes off or the other toes are off and you're
Yeah.
walking, toe walking or yeah, interesting. Any last thing you want to share about feet before we wrap it up?
Um, and just that they're significantly undertrained. Um, but as your interface with the ground and almost like that's how you generate force is in contact with the ground. Super important and something that more individuals need to address. And there's a whole lot there more than just calf raises and toe scrunches.
A whole lot there. And I want to add one thing I forgot because you mentioned asymmetry earlier. And now that I've learned
Mhm.
about the right spiral of our, with our diaphragm and our liver and everything heavier on the right, I didn't understand why my left foot kind of collapsed in and my right
Mm.
foot collapsed out. And that and that unwinding that when that gets really big, the feet are both like crazy off. So I've learned to, that's been part of learning to address my hip instability as well is and your program was I think I already mentioned I did it twice already. I think I'm going to do it
Yeah.
again. And maybe it's because I broke that metatarsal. I have all this ligament stuff. I until I can walk barefoot more often, I need to just keep on my strengthening game if I want to keep doing African dance till I'm 120. Right?
Yeah.
You're
But
coming to class with me, right?
yeah,
You're going or
absolutely.
go to Guinea with me. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll dance in the woods.
Yeah. I'd rather go there than California right now. But um, that reminded me of two things. So one, we talked about issues at the foot going up the chain. It can go the other way around as well. So I've had individuals with very arthritic hips who have like essentially no internal rotation. And because of that, they'll really struggle to get to the inside edge of their foot. And so as they squat down, because the femurs don't want to rotate in at all and everything gets shoved out, they'll end up on the outside of their foot. I've also, you know, I used to have a lot of issues with my left hip. And it's kind of goes into that PRI stuff as well, with like most people having less internal rotation on their left hip. But either way, part of the key for getting some of that range back for me was learning to put pressure on the inside and forcing myself to use that. And then like as I allowed that movement to happen, the hips started to open up more and more. And then it just kind of fed into itself. Um, and then I lost the second thing I was going to say, but
All right. Well, I'm going to go put on some toe spacers and barefoot shoes and take a
yeah,
walk, Nick. Since you're
nice.
not coming to do any African dance with me in California, and I'm not
Yeah,
coming up to Calgary anytime soon. Oh, but everyone can find you, the website.
it's vitalstrengthphysiology.com. We have our foot program there. We have our hip program there as well, which integrates a lot of the same concepts.
And I
Um,
worked with you as a trainer remotely during COVID too. That was good.
yeah,
And listeners get a discount on the program, a $20 discount if they enter
yeah,
the code moving as designed.
nice.
Moving as designed. Cool. Well, Nick, thank you. I can't wait to get stronger feet.
Actually, I did remember one thought.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
I don't know
Not
if you want
by.
to
Yeah, let's
edit
keep
this in,
going.
but
Let's keep going.
the other thing was, for the movement, the movement crowd may be more inherently interested in this, but I firmly believe that even if you're still like a meathead lifter, again, because of the implications of this, it has so much benefits to your performance. And I initially, when I learned about all of the rotations in movement, um, and then thought about what we were doing in the weight room, my initial take was like, wow, nothing we do in the weight room addresses any of this rotational need. Everything's so linear up and down. But then when I started to observe more of the best lifters in the world, you realize that all of those things are still there. We're just not coaching them. But when you learning to use your foot properly unlocks a whole lot of potential in regular lifting as well.
Yeah, that the nonlinear is there. We just don't see it or coach it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, my background in West African dance, that's very
Well,
spinal, multidimensional. Once I learned to bring that over and put it on top of running, oh my
yeah,
God. Oh my God. Because running looked like such a robotic drudgery
yeah,
and it just didn't feel good. And once I learned that how to
oh
use
yeah,
more of my weight, it's become like a dance.
yeah. And it's exactly like that Usain Bolt video where he's literally setting the world record and people are commenting, look at how inefficient his movement is and how much faster he would run if everything was just straight back and forth. But people will do that to lifters and other athletes too, but they'll see the best Olympic lifters in the world with these huge rotational movements through their
And
lower
like,
body and be like, oh, like, look at all those energy leaks. Let's make sure we don't do that because you'll hurt yourself. But
yep, yep. And it's the exact opposite that we can only, when we recycle all these forces with these curvilinear, uh, you know, uh, forms, because that's what's natural. Everything
yeah,
is taking gravity and moving it in these liquid moves in these spiral like forms. And we are these pressure systems and linear stuff. Like if you think of the stop signs in a four-way street, every vehicle has to completely lose all of its momentum
mm-hmm.
versus a roundabout where every vehicle is maintaining its momentum. So I'm glad that we talked, Nick. You've been one of my biggest inspirations the last 4 or 5 years. We made it through lockdowns. That
Yeah.
was one of the best parts of lockdown is meeting you. All right.
Great to
Thank you
talk,
very
Jen.
much.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye.